Welcome, and thank you for joining us today as we speak about the rapidly evolving role of DEI in the workplace. My name is Joanna Kim. I am Chief Legal Officer and EVP of Regulatory Affairs at Trusaic. I've been with Trusaic for almost 10 years, and prior to that time, I was with the law firms of Aiken Gump and Pillsbury Winthrop for combined 17 years. My background is a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from UC Berkeley and a JD from Loyola. My areas of expertise include tax and employment law, and I oversee the regulatory aspects of Trusaic's DEI and pay equity lines of business. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague here, Julia De Beers, who will be discussing with me the important topic of DEI today. Julia is Chief Administrative Officer and General Counsel of Evans Hotel. Since 2014, she has been responsible for overseeing legal, risk management, human resources, and technology groups for her organization. She's formerly with Aiken Gump, where she served as a member of the firm's litigation and labor and employment practices. She has a BA cum laude from USC and a JD cum laude from University of Michigan Law School. Welcome, everyone. So let's get started. Okay, so today's discussion, we're going to cover first, the background into the evolution of DEI, including corporate counsel's role in the elimination of bias. We'll then launch into discussion of the DEI Maturity Model and sort of the three tiers of that, which is entry, intermediate, and advanced. We'll discuss characteristics of the leaders in DEI, and then we're going to finish up to leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, so let's get started. The evolution of DEI. Now, DEI is ramping up. Why are we hearing so much about it now, more than ever? What are the trends that have led to this change, and why should corporate counsel care? Okay, next slide. Okay, well, there are a number of reasons that make DEI increasingly important with time. So the first is increased public, customer, investor pressure. There's an increasing trend towards corporate social responsibility, ESG reporting, where the S part of ESG is social. There's increasing movement towards standardization of reporting relating to an organization's diversity and pay equity metrics. And perhaps in the not too distant future, there may be mandatory reporting of these kind of metrics, particularly for global organizations. Additionally, you have things like movements like Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, and even COVID has really had a huge impact, making pay inequity and DEI even more important to the public. So in terms of the sort of public, customer, investor pressure, Julia, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's really interesting because I think that most people in our particular field, in-house counsel or otherwise, have found over the last 3 or 4 years that the amount of discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion in general has really escalated. So we're in really a different world where it went from, I think most people felt 10 years ago that DEI was a little bit more lip service than actual action. And we're now actually in a stage in a different arena. So why is that the case? Why are we hearing so much about this now? I think that people have found that there was a disconnect sometimes between the corporate leadership and staff and sometimes the markets that they serve. So there were competitive advantages to having more DEI expressly included. And frankly, the current both political climate and the current trends, whether it's Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, really make this much more of a time-critical issue for people to show that they're not only aware, but actually committed to and taking actionable steps towards actually making progress in DEI. So I think most organizations feel that it went from really being something people were working on in the background to a much higher priority in the last year or two.
Another area that I wanted to get into and sort of what's kind of the forces behind DEI ramping up are regulatory and legal pressures. And I'm going to get into sort of the details of that, but just kind of as a preview, some of the aspects are increasing pay transparency, increasing pay data reporting, broader coverage with respect to what can be allowed in a pay discrimination lawsuit, diversity requirements on boards, like in particular in California with both gender and underrepresented minorities. And internationally, there's been a trend towards DEI-related reporting, whether it's UK, France, Canada, Iceland, Switzerland, France, and Germany. Julia, do you have any thoughts on this sort of additional sort of regulatory and legal pressure?
It's only going to be getting worse.
Right,
as
right.
time goes on. You see, I think, more pay transparency laws. New York recently added a couple of different requirements as well. And so certainly in terms of California, more liberal states, we do expect to see more and more detailed both reporting requirements, publicity requirements, and frankly, more administrative actions on actually pursuing and suing, right? Agencies pursuing and suing based on pay equity laws. I think that Tesla or SpaceX actually recently was notified that they were having a number of issues on this front.
Okay. And there's also the tight labor market, and there's more choices for workers. I mean, right now, you've heard about the Great Resignation. So many workers are changing jobs. This is particularly so sort of post COVID zeitgeist, where remote working is the norm, as I am doing and currently Julia's doing. I mean, that's very common, particularly in the professional workforce, where attracting and retaining talent can be the most competitive. And, and in general, the younger people, DEI is a bigger consideration, as you had alluded to, Julia. So, have you had a sense of sort of how tight the market is with regard to getting workers in sort of DEI?
Certainly in my particular industry, which is hospitality right now, it is a tough hiring market all around. And I think that it is extremely fair to say that certainly people joining the workforce right now are very interested in not only the company's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and then actually what happens once you get into the workforce, right? Is their experience match what the, in essence, pre-marketing sales job to get people in the organization is, especially from a diversity and inclusion standpoint. So are they seeing a diverse workforce? Are people's contributions being valued? Are there ways to connect with colleagues? I think that hospitality is a little bit unique in that it is fundamentally more difficult to work remotely in that area. So we don't have quite as many connection challenges with building culture when everybody's working from home as well. But I can certainly see how that presents an additional challenge.
So, I mean, what we're basically talking about is sort of a confluence of a bunch of factors making DEI just increasingly important. Next slide. So what's corporate counsel's role in DEI? I mean, in order for DEI initiatives to be successful, they, as Julia, as you had pointed out, you can't just relegate it to just some person in the organization. And that may have been what had happened in the past. I mean, success in the DEI space is going to require full support with everybody, the entire executive team and at different levels of the workforce. And corporate counsel has a unique role. I mean, corporate counsel, their jobs, as a sort of fundamental training is about managing risk. And so their input in providing guidance in DEI is going to be critical. And I just also note, corporate counsel in most states, certainly in California, you have these sort of CLE obligations dealing with the elimination of bias, something that DEI initiatives seek to address. So I want to talk about DEI initiatives. Julia, do you have any additional thoughts relating to sort of corporate counsel's role?
I think that the way many corporate organizations work is that counsel in general, the legal department, has a very interesting and important role to play in DEI initiatives. And part of it has to do with not just understanding the risk, and that might be legal risk, compliance risk, fines, but frankly, even just PR risk. It's something that I think that we are uniquely uniquely able to both handle and also uniquely positioned in the organization to see things and be in the thick of things when companies are in crisis. And in terms of both preventing problems and really because DEI is fundamentally can be a culture change within an organization. It's hard and it requires silo busting and in a way to flex throughout the organization in a way that I think many legal departments are one of the few areas that really touch operational and administrative departments that you don't necessarily get. So the legal function, right, can not only operate throughout the organization, but can help understand the risk, can help mitigate the risk, and frankly, even do specific analyses like equal pay analysis, plan through how you address potential issues of discrimination and harassment within an attorney-client protected method where you can, in fact, minimize risk and have open and honest discussions that you can't always do in other levels of the organization. But it's important to say that the legal department cannot carry the water alone. It has to be something that is throughout the organization, throughout leadership, or else the change doesn't come easily.
Sure. This is all hands on deck for sure. Okay, next slide. Let's switch over and kind of sort of drill into sort of elimination of bias. This is sort of a, elimination of bias is the conceptual result of successful DEI planning with the positive DEI metrics sort of quantifying the result. So what I want to kind of drill down to is sort of, well, what kind of tools do we have in terms of laws and regulations that deal with elimination of bias? And those are essentially the anti-discrimination laws. In the federal framework, we have Title VII and Equal Pay Act. We also have, the institution of the, EEOC, which came just after that. And so we're talking about now, 70 years since, and we still are having pay gaps at the gender level and at the minority level. Notwithstanding sort of mandatory demographics reporting that the EEOC did, as well as, for a brief period, right before the Trump administration came on board, there was this EEO1 component 2 reporting, which was pay data reporting, and then it essentially stalled during the Trump administration, and it may be revived. So, there has, and I think that EEO1 component 2 reporting was in some sense sort of recognizing that the existing federal framework wasn't doing enough to move the needle in terms of pay gaps. And so I think that was the reason to sort of collect that data and analyze it. So that's those are some of the federal frameworks. Next slide. And what we have seen is on the state level, really kind of tackling the federal framework to provide more, at least in theory, protection against bias, if you will. So among the trends I'm going to talk about first is the trend towards tightening defenses available to employers. So in your, as a sort of an employer-employee situation, the basic framework, both federal and state law, what you see is, when you're looking at pay discrimination, you want to be looking at substantially similar or comparable work, as opposed to the more rigid framework of equal pay equals, equal work, equal pay, or equal pay for equal work. That was sort of the basic framework. And really over the last about 5 years, states have been loosening that. So like, for example, in California, it would be, equal pay for substantially similar work. So what that allows is basically broadening the cohort size of the employees that could be sort of compared for pricing purposes. Another area is limiting the affirmative defenses against pay discrimination. The basic pay discrimination framework is, you got to pay, equal pay for substantially similar or comparable work, but you can account for these sort of wage influencing factors, such as tenure, seniority. There's like a quantification one where, like if you're paying based on widgets, for example, and also merits. But importantly, there's this other factor, a factor other than sex in the case of gender, and a factor other than race in the case of racial discrimination. So this factor, historically, a lot of things were sort of shoehorned in there to sort of justify pay discrimination. And what has happened over the last few years is states have said, no, any factor you're looking at, it better be actually legitimate, like it's actually tied to, the job and consistent with business necessity. So they're not these sort of arbitrary and capricious factors. And what it does is it tightens an employer's ability to say, well, I get that Susie's being paid less than John, but there are a bunch of reasons for it. And if you do the statistical analysis, you'll see that actually they're being paid the same, even though superficially they may look like they're getting paid different. So there's tightening of that. Another area are equal pay safe harbors. And those are basically where an employer actually conducts a pay equity audit. There's certain benefits that come out of it. Massachusetts is probably the broadest one, and notably, it's only for Massachusetts under Massachusetts law. So if you're also dealing with a federal claim, that equal pay safe harbor isn't going to provide any protection for that. So, but at least with the state level, it provides a complete defense. And notably, so you do pay equity audit, and if you do one, you don't actually have to achieve pay equity, but you have to make reasonable progress. And then that gives you a complete defense for a certain amount of time. So there's some, value in doing that. And at least in Massachusetts case, what they were trying to do is provide encouragement for employers to just assess where they are. At a lighter level, you've got Oregon and Colorado, where you get safe harbors from other kind of damages, but they're not quite as, broad in the complete defense sense as in the case of Massachusetts. Next slide. And some other areas include trends towards pay transparency. It's, the basic gist of that would be the requirement to post job salary ranges. But there's, like in California, you don't have to actually post it, but if the candidate asks for it, you got to provide that range. And so there's a trend towards that also just in the last few years. That's been happening. Another trend is pay data reporting. And as I mentioned earlier about the EOC and the component 2 reporting, it was going on for a couple of years, but it stopped during the Trump administration, and not clear if it's going to come back or not. And it looks like some of the states have sort of picked up the slack. In California's case last year, they started doing California pay data reporting, essentially the same structure as the EOC component 2 reporting. They added in some nuances like, now it's not just male, female, there's also a non-binary component. There's some weird nuances because of remote workers, but at its core, it's basically that reporting that got halted, that EEO1 component 2 reporting. Illinois has the same type of requirement, but Illinois is taking it one step further. You actually have to submit an equal compliance statement where you're basically saying, I am complying with all of these, federal and under their state discrimination laws. So you're going to need to know that you are in fact complying without just making that assertion. So it's a big deal, and that really starts applying this year. And then lastly, and I believe it's only California where there's diversity requirements on boards for both gender and minorities. And I'm sorry, not lastly, penultimately. Then lastly, there's salary history bans, and there's a ton of states that have imposed that, and there's a bunch of local ones, even for states that don't have it. And the salary history ban essentially being that you, as an employer, you can't ask a job applicant what that person was previously getting paid. The theory behind it being, you're essentially perpetuating pay discrimination if there was one. So you're sort of starting with on the same level for each candidate you're looking at. And in some respects, it's sort of the bookend to pay transparency. On the one hand, you can ask what people got paid before, and on the other hand, you need to, disclose or post the salary ranges. That's going to be sort of the new method of figuring out what salary should be proposed. And there are also, just lastly, some state laws governing attorney behavior in connection with elimination of bias. So that's, essentially the tools that are available at the regulatory and legal level to address elimination of bias, and in that respect to advance DEI. So switching gears, Julia, next slide. Julia, can you discuss the rising DEI in the workplace?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the question of how has this become so big so recently? And in 2018, so this is now 4 years ago, the CEO of BlackRock, a very large asset management and institutional management firm that you might have heard of before, said in his annual letter to CEOs that it's not just about profits, and really focused on purpose-driven organization and how that purpose is not inconsistent with profit. So that the profits are in no way inconsistent with purpose, that they're inextricably linked. And that if a company is to effectively serve all of its stakeholders, shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities that they serve, they really need to actually look at purpose, and that diversity, right, that social governance, that environmental social governance really plays a part in the fundamental purpose and profitability of a company. And he actually focused that CEO letter 2 years in a row on that, which is how you ended up getting a lot more board focus for large corporations on DEI and environmental and social responsibility. So once you have asset management, private equity, and the SEC all saying this is important and you have a responsibility board to your shareholders to be looking at this, it's one of the reasons why you have a lot more focus on this in the corporate world in general.
Next slide. And to that point of, looking at DEI, looking at purpose, it's important to note that DEI, in fact, increases profitability. Probably the most famous study that was done was by McKinsey. And what they basically found was that if you actually pay attention to DEI, it actually improves your profitability. Probably a little bit lesser known, the sort of board ready survey, what they found was, consistent increase in year-to-year revenues if there is racial and gender diversity, within the company. So at the end of the day, treating DEI as a business function makes sense, and not putting siloing it with one person, but actually treating it as a business function. Trusaic sponsored a study with Harvard Business Review Analytics in partnership with SHRM last year, which echoes this proposition that DEI is in fact tied to profitability. And what that study found was that the top third of successful DEI organizations, i.e. the leaders, saw greater revenue increases in the last 2 years than the bottom third of these organizations, aka laggards. And Julia, do you have any thoughts on sort of why that is the case? Why is DEI related to profitability?
I think it really has to do with both being more flexible with reducing what is called, it's essentially a psychological principle called groupthink, where you have so many people who have similar experiences, they tend to think alike, and it is harder to respond to a competitive environment when you have people thinking about issues the same way, whether it's the communities that you serve, whether it's marketing snafus, whether it is really just how are you going to respond to a global pandemic? Having flexibility and diversity is something that improves the overall strength of an organization, certainly according to the studies. Now, as coming from an organization that actually does pretty well in diversity, we would all like to think it's really based on our own efforts. So it can be tough to say, right, whether or not your how much your competitive advantage is truly linked, but the numbers are hard to argue with when you see that kind of correlation.
Next slide. Now, this probably isn't too surprising in that the diversity actually benefits employees. What I found particularly surprising was how much it improves it. So 5 times more likely to see improvement in attracting talent, 5 times more likely to see improvement in retaining talent, 3 times more likely in seeing improvement in team diversity, twice as likely to see improvement in employee engagement. twice as likely to see improvement in collaboration, and 3 times more likely to see improvement in innovation. So DEI has fundamental benefits to employees. And, with a generational expectation of younger talent, there's going to be more emphasis on DEI, and likely the numbers will increase. Julia, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I think my personal experience, although albeit all in California, does show that this is actually happening on the ground. The number of certainly pointed questions that people coming right out of school are asking in this area, it's something that people are more comfortable addressing directly, and they're paying attention to how people respond. There was a consultant I was talking to who actually found one of the most interesting things they asked in terms of retention was, who is your best friend at work, right? And the finding was that if you really had someone that you considered a close work friend at work, you were much more likely to stay there, to be satisfied, to be fulfilled. And so if you are both trying to recruit and maintain a diverse workforce, right, those types of friendships and connection and both diversity and shared experience is really important to actually maintain your workforce and to keep the talent in the long term.
Next slide. Well, what I want to make sure is that we don't overlook the pay equity piece. And because it is the most data intensive, all the sort of metrics to collect to sort of figure out where you are. And it's data intensive, it can be messy, so it's hard to collect and validate and make sure you have accurate data. And then you have to run these sort of statistical analysis, so it's complicated. So in some respects, pay, like people go to a job, and while it's not the only consideration, it's a huge consideration of how much you're getting paid. So pay is often the most visible, and it's certainly the most complicated aspect of sort of figuring things out and risk related in the DEI space. And here's just some statistics really kind of, emphasizing that organizations that promote pay equity see greater employee retention, new talent attraction, and increased business performance. That's really sort of the key, that, employees want to know they're being paid fairly. And that has, certainly different dimensions to it. But the bottom line is that they're getting paid fairly with respect to their peers. Julia, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
It is a complex area, pay equity, and these studies are complicated, not easy, but they're important.
Next slide. And the main point that I wanted to raise on this one is really just, you can't ignore it. If you ignore pay equity, it's gonna cost you. And we were kind of talking about the sort of the tools in the sort of federal, state, regulatory, legal framework dealing with discrimination. But pay equity is, if you don't have pay equity, essentially what you're going to have is pay discrimination. So it's extremely risk sensitive. In DEI in general, diversity, inclusion, these other aspects of equity, they're a good business and they lead to greater profitability. But if you ignore the pay equity piece, you are going to have potential significant legal risk and potential impact to the organization's bottom line and reputation. And this is just an illustration of that. Okay, next slide. So with that background, let's switch gears and let's talk about the DEI Maturity Model. Next slide. So this is like a really messy slide. There's a lot of information on it. I'm just going to skim through it, and you're going to get a copy of the slide so you can look at it in detail. But the DEI Maturity Model essentially has 3 tiers, but really it's kind of a spectrum. It's not like, it's you may be kind of late, early, or beginning, intermediate, so on. And what we'll see is, a lot of organizations are in that early category. And the key is sort of figuring out where you are and trying to ascend to the higher levels. And, and in order to do that, it's important to make sure you understand the metrics of it. And sort of in simple form, how will you know where you want to go if you don't know where you are? How will you know whatever mechanisms you put in to ascend to the next level. How do you know if you're getting there, and how quickly are you getting there? And if you are trying to assess accountability to sort of make it happen, how will you sort of assess whether or not the accountability, you know, that people who are accountable are actually delivering on the results you're expecting? And, you know, as I had mentioned, a lot of people are in the early stage. You know, some people are, you know, some organizations are farther along and others are at the beginning. And it's probably, you know, safe to say larger sort of more resource organizations may be further along. Not the case necessarily, but they certainly have the resources to be further along. But, you know, everyone's going to be in a different place in their DEI journey, and no one should feel bad about where they stand. You know, DEI is a work in progress, and even those people at the top in the advance, they're still trying to figure things out. You know, there's a lot of art and you know, and some science in there, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's a group effort, and you want to, you know, it's a big project, if you will. It's a big business function, and so, you know, these changes in the sort of DEI stats don't move quickly. I like to say, you know, with regard to DEI, you know, you want to move the needle, but you don't get to touch the dial. So you're just shaking that table, and a lot of these things that you're doing are shaking that table to move that needle. And the most important thing is about understanding where you are and what you know, your commitment to move forward. Next slide. Okay, so I'll just briefly talk about level one, and, you know, there's sort of the elements described here. You know, level one is sort of early stage. Initial steps are taken to sort of document DEI goals and objectives. There is a common reactive response to overall DEI program, and there's no set guidelines or policies in place. There is a lacking of sort of DEI culture. They don't measure, they don't really do DEI measurements. And to the extent there is sort of DEI management, it's inconsistent. So this is, you know, basically early level. And I believe a lot of organizations that would still be in the early, they've actually taken care of some of these things. But this is just kind of, you know, sort of a snapshot of an early organization in the early stage. And as I mentioned, you know, it's not about where you are, it's about understanding where you are and, you know, having a commitment to move forward. And, you know, the problem with this tier is obviously there's also a lot of risk. And so that's another thing to consider. And, you know, the key is how will you get to the next level if you're at this level? And some of the things to look at is putting DEI metrics in place, measuring your baseline, acknowledge where you are, define your goals, and communicate your commitment and progress to your appropriate stakeholders to get to the next level. Next slide. At level two, this is where the organizations have made some significant inroads in actually achieving DEI success. And, you know, they have their baseline, they have goals, they have metrics, they monitor it, and they review it regularly. There's alignment with corporate and legal stakeholders. You know, leadership is actually involved. They've begun to sort of close gaps where they exist, and they're making progress towards achieving their DEI goals. And they're doing regular reporting on progress and compliance. Now, so, you know, this is a pretty good place to be if you can be there. And, you know, so, but, you know, this is not a place of complacency. DEI is hard, you know, getting to the next level. You know, what do you need to do to get to the next level? You know, utilizing and routinely acting on the sort of metrics that you have, and, you know, dealing with it. One of the key areas in metrics is sort of what's called root cause analysis. And that's particularly in pay, where you'll see kind of, you know, clusters or hot zones in particular departments or under certain managers, where you'll see they're really outliers in pay, for example. It doesn't have to be pay. There are other metrics. You know, it could be promotions. It could be hiring, things like that. There are other metrics, but there is sort of an unusual outlier-y type statistics related with a department or a manager that might be telling you something about that department or that manager. And so these, you know, these metrics will give you insight on sort of qualitative issues that your organization may have. You know, additionally, sort of getting to the next level, communicating progress to stakeholders, having that sort of dedicated commitment that's ongoing to advance DEI, and also having it, you know, leadership sort of having accountability aligned to achieving certain goals. All right, next slide. So level 3, this is the gold standard. One of the things that, it's basically, workforces are fluid, and, just because you've achieved it at one point, if you have, a number of people leaving and new people coming on board, well, the snapshot is totally changed. And, because of that, even if you had achieved it, you have to make sure you're maintaining it. And level 3 folks are constantly monitoring that, on a periodic basis. So, one of the things to consider once you've actually kind of hit, DEI nirvana is, certification. Although you can do certification at any point in the pyramid. And certification, so for example, if you're at the early stage, you might get certification to show that you've actually made a commitment to make authentic change, and you're doing, an eyes open analysis and you're certifying to that effect, essentially. And, certification organizations, there's a number of them. The key thing is it's independent. It's basically independent audit of your DEI metrics. And they look at other things, in addition to that, they also look at policies and procedures, things of that nature. So that's something to consider. Okay, Julia, what trends have you seen in terms of where companies are on the chart?
I'm here to make everybody feel better and say we're all in the early stages. I think so much of this really depends on the individual nature of your organization, right? Like, what's your size? What's your market? What's your location? So for example, a lot of San Francisco technology companies are very aware of this, and perhaps a little bit further along in terms of the corporate infrastructure, which might be fundamentally different from a small hospitality shop that has 2 or 3 in-house attorneys in it. So I think that a lot of this is really based on, in looking at most DEI initiatives and where you are, it really is important to take a sense of what your organizational readiness is, right? You might be very early in the stage, or you might even be at a place where you're really just starting to think about DEI initiatives and figuring out, what is this, why do we care, and how do we actually make some organizational change on this. I think that it is very common for people to have a lack of diversity throughout the organization. It's very common to have a mismatch between leadership and staff and the communities that they're serving. So really it's about starting your journey, knowing where you are, and having an idea of where you want to get to, because you can't really get somewhere without actually knowing where you are.
Okay, next slide. So I want to make sure we're mindful of the time, so I'm going to rush through some of these slides. So, in dealing with accountability, I think a lot of times when people hear the word accountability, they think, oh, stick. And as I mentioned before, accountability doesn't have to be like that. A lot of organizations that try to sort of have accountability metrics, they use sort of the carrot method with incentives or bonuses of achieving certain DEI milestones. I had mentioned our Trusaic HBR study, and one of the things that I, really kind of bolstering this is what they found is among like the top 3 factors in terms of what causes or what hindrances to DEI is lack of accountability. It's like, okay, we're going to just, relegate Susie Smith as the DEI person, and then, she's going to come up with some initiatives. Whether or not anything happens, it just kind of disappears into the ether. But having, so these metrics, this person needs to achieve them, and if that person achieves these metrics, or maybe it's not just one person, but, department or whatever, here are the incentives that come with it, and sort of tying progress to that is really important, a key aspect on making it work. And on accountability, corporate counsel is, they're really in a unique position to manage risk, so they really need to be part of that team. I'm not necessarily saying they need to be accountable, but they need to be part of that team that makes, key decisions in the DEI planning. Okay, next slide. Yeah, in terms of the DEI metrics that are measured, successful organizations will have measurements for inclusion, diversity, and equity. what those metrics look like really is a function of sort of what's, important relative to your business, what kind of industry you're in, and so forth. But there's many different things that can be measured. It's not just pay and representation. There's promotions, there's hiring rates, there's even attrition rates. All of those things can be sliced and diced in a way that'll really provide meaningful insight to your organization. Okay, next slide. So, we're all talking about, well, you need to know where you are before you can figure out where you want to go. And so here are some questions to think about in terms of determining, where you are. And these are kind of some of the things that you can ask about. Are there policies documented? Are there processes in place? What are you measuring? Are you compliant with various DEI related laws? What extent are your stakeholders involved? What about your employees? Are you certified for compliance? Julia, do you have additional, sort of thought-provoking questions to help determine where you are?
I think it's really helpful to really think about your leadership commitment to not just to also doing the work, right? Like, this isn't something. Experts are very helpful to have in this, but I think that people get the most mileage when you see active leadership participation instead of delegation. Like, who are your internal champions? What's the support structure? Is this something that really everybody has bought into? And I think that really ends up being one of the things that is truly necessary for a successful DEI program. And it's not a knock on any organization to not be there yet. This is a developing area, and there might need to be a lot of understanding and education of the value. I think that one of the most helpful things right now, based on where we are, is to really look at what your competitors are doing. What are the other boards of organizations of your size and area working on? Can you see that competitive advantage or disadvantage in action?
Okay, next slide. And I think, to Julia's point, you can't just, sort of outsource your DEI, but because it's complicated, I think it's important and leaders have help, implementing it, analyzing it, and so on. So, the organization has to run the show. They can't ship it somewhere else, but they will need help. So let's talk, go to the next slide. DEI partners help organizations achieve goals. And, leaders in DEI have actually seen greater benefits from employing these experts. We did a study through, the HBR study, and consistently leaders have actually recognized there are certain things that they do not have the expertise to handle, but they also recognize that they need to be, they need to have sort of full support of the C-suite, as well as through the organization, to make sure this is done. And it's not just some, kind of cookie cutter, here's the DEI plan that we just bought. It's not like that. You have to have full commitment by the leadership to make a DEI plan work. But, in employing their experts, the kind of metrics they've actually seen improved measurement with inclusion outcomes, equity outcomes, diversity outcomes, and that what they've seen is accelerated progress towards their goals and development of better DEI strategy. So if there is someone, like if you hire someone, this is going to be someone who has experience in DEI, that certainly is going to facilitate that. But if you don't have one, the answer isn't let's not do anything because we don't have any experts who can handle it. You can get that easily. And, it's really been shown that looking out for assistance in that area where you don't have expertise is valuable. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to take a quick moment to talk about Trusaic's PayParity solution. It is basically an all-in-one pay equity, diversity, inclusion platform that can facilitate your organization's DEI success. It makes it easy for you to measure your DEI baseline and progress along the journey as you ascend the DEI Maturity Model. So that concludes our presentation. And so let's take a few minutes now to do some questions and answers.